I'm going to introduce this topic of organic seed yields based on this research project that some of you may have heard about, but is something that Organic Seed Alliance has been working on now, has been planning for quite a while, and are now working on with a lot of partners and growers and a large team around trying to do organic seed production research and economics and yield. This is known as the Osprey project. I'm just going to give you kind of an overview of that project and a little bit of what we've been seeing just from this last year, 2025 being the first year of our trials, to kind of show you a little bit of our approach to trying to understand seed yields and their impact on economics. And then, like I said, once we get into the breakout rooms, if anyone wants to join me, we can talk about some more questions and ideas from all of you in terms of how to understand or increase or manage your yields on seed. So Osprey, this is an acronym standing for Organic Seed Production Research on Economics and Yield. And this project comes from ultimately just from a lot of different conversations that we at Organic Seed Alliance have had over the years, but even more specifically, every 5 years we do something called the State of Organic Seed project, where we survey organic producers, seed companies, seed producers, researchers, certifiers, and look at the state of where organic seed is at, what some of the needs and opportunities and challenges are for our organic seed systems. And in our last survey, we reached out to organic seed producers and asked them about some of their production challenges. And this slide here shows amongst the responses that we got, two of the top challenges that were reported to us were either achieving adequate seed yields or just estimating yields. And we heard this again and again, both in the survey responses and in follow-up interviews that we did. Responses kind of like this, or one of the folks that we interviewed said, I feel like just having more data on yield would be useful just to figure out how much we need to grow. It's not so much like we experience the super low yields, which we have sometimes, but it's more just like if there was data out there that said you need this many feet of this variety or similar varieties in order to get X amount of seed yield. These questions came up again and again around just trying to understand, how much a given variety, a given crop type, in a given area might yield, and what are some ways to potentially increase those yields or reduce the risk of, having really poor yields. And so that developed into this project, Osprey, that has these three primary objectives of organic seed yield research, seed economics research, so translating some of that yield and production information into, how to make a livelihood growing seed, and then taking all of that and providing education, outreach, and information exchange to get the information out into the hands of growers and make it useful to everyone. This project, we are working with a lot of collaborators across the country. You can see some of the partners here. In addition, working with many, many seed growers throughout the country, and I'll show you that in a minute. But this kind of shows the overall sort of structure of the project. You can see there are a lot of different pieces to it, and I'll break those down a little bit. And part of that is because these questions are complicated and intertwined in terms of what matters for yield, what matters for a seed grower's livelihood. So on the research side, we're doing replicated trials, management trials, participatory trials, and collecting historic seed yield data from existing records that producers and companies have. On the economic side, we're collecting information on labor costs and equipment costs and trying to understand develop enterprise budgets and understand what are fair prices for seed growers to be receiving in order to have a livelihood growing seed, because ultimately seed growers are the heart of a successful seed system. And in order for, many seed growers to be able to continue to do this year in and year out of developing, maintaining, distributing seeds, um, they need to be able to, you know, make a livelihood. And honestly, a lot of seed companies don't necessarily know, especially organic seed companies and smaller ones, don't necessarily know what a fair price is, what seed growers need to make a livelihood. And so getting this information and tying it to this economic data is really key. And then kind of coming out of that, like I mentioned, we have ways to share and connect growers and produce and companies and others in the seed system with this information and with each other through, field days and other in-person events, webinars, videos and guides, posters, articles, etc. And then we're trying to make sure that this project is effective. So we have a lot of ways to evaluate the project itself, because we see this as just sort of the start of a project that we expect to grow both at Organic Seed Alliance and beyond OSA. And so looking at it kind of as a model and asking hard questions about what's working and not working is key to that. So let me dig into a little bit of like the research design of this, because I think it's helpful as we think about trying to understand seed yields even at your own farm level. So part of this project relies on these multi-location replicated seed yield trials. And what I mean by that is that we have trial sites in California, Colorado, Oregon, North Carolina, New York, Vermont, and Washington, where we're all growing the same set of 4 core crops: tomatoes, lettuce, squash, and broccoli, that have been identified as some of the most kind of widely produced seed crops, with kind of a range of like wet seeded and dry seeded. And we're growing the same varieties at all of those sites, and we're growing them in a replicated fashion, meaning that we're growing each variety 4 times in 4 different parts of each of our 7 fields, with the idea to try to understand a little bit of how seed yield varies based on a variety within a crop type and based on these different environments. You can kind of see this is like a basic example of the layout of one of the crops. So like this is lettuce, for example, and we have red salad bowl, green towers, black seeded Simpson. This is a map imagining those as beds, and we have them randomized throughout the field so that there isn't necessarily, just because one part of the field had a little more fertility or a different soil type, that we can still capture some of that and sort of account for that variability through replication. And the same kind of layout we have for all of the other crops. In addition to those replicated trials, we're working with many seed growers throughout the country and beyond to grow their own trials and collect yield data on those, both including the same varieties that we're growing at those replicated trials and including some of the crops that growers are just already growing, sort of these grow your own trials. And the power that we see in this combination of doing these replicated trials at those 7 sites, along with collecting and working with organic seed producers all around the country and beyond, is that those replicated sites can kind of serve as anchors. We'll be growing those same varieties year after year for 3 years running with the replication, and can kind of set some sort of baseline expectations around the differences that we might be seeing in varieties and yields. And then we'll have this real on-the-ground information from producers that we can compare to and expand out and get a better sense of all the other places that both all the other places and regions and climates that our replicated trials aren't capturing, and the wide range of management strategies and production systems that growers use to start to tease out what affects seed yield. In addition, one of the things that we're starting, but I think is just opening the book on and really asking questions more than necessarily answering them yet. But we started some comparative, what we call management trials, where we're taking that same design that we had, where we have the 3 different varieties of each of these 4 crops that are replicated. But now we've done at some of our sites some comparisons where we might have, for example, in New York and Vermont, they grew all of their varieties under caterpillar tunnels versus just out in open field to see how that compares. Or here in California and up in Oregon, we're comparing different irrigation levels and seeing how much having limited irrigation late in the season, which is an issue for a lot of seed growers in the West that might have some water access issues later in the season, seeing how much those reduced irrigation levels impact seed yields. Or something that we're going to be doing next year is kind of trying to answer some questions about how much space is really required to get optimal yields. Is it better at times to pack the seed crops in a little tighter and maybe you get a slightly lower per plant seed yield, but an overall higher per bed seed yield? Or is it better to spread those plants out, let them grow larger, maybe have better airflow, for example, for disease and seed quality? A lot of these questions are things that we're just starting to answer now. And then, like I said, tying all of that to economics so that we can, as growers are considering both like what varieties to grow and also negotiating with seed companies on contracts to understand, the range in yields and the range in input costs and labor costs and what are fair prices to pay. So as an example, something like tomatoes, we know that there is a range in yield between something like a cherry tomato and a paste tomato, but the prices that growers receive for growing those crops may not really fully capture that difference in yield. They may get a slight boost for growing something that's a lower seed yielder like a paste tomato, but in reality it may be that they're only getting half of the yield from a paste tomato versus a cherry tomato. And so, a fair price for a paste tomato maybe needs to be twice the price per pound of a cherry, for example. But on the flip side, cherry tomatoes can take a lot more work in management. And so we're working with agricultural economists to try to figure out sort of what are some, net returns, per plant, per acre, per bed. What are those, prices, that you would receive that would allow you to break even or have, a crop that allows you to have a livelihood. So I borrowed some of these slides from Nico Engelbert, who's the CEO of SeedLinked and has been doing a lot of our data crunching, but just to share a little bit of some of the things we saw from 2025 at the end of my presentation here. Starting out kind of back to the beginning of like, what are some of the things that we'd like to answer at the end of this 4-year project or even beyond, because we expect this project to continue after the kind of current 4 years. But really it's this idea of, at the end of the day, we would love to have something that looks like a database or a search tool or something where a grower can answer a question like this of like, okay, what could I expect in terms of yield for, a Brandywine tomato on my farm? And so, trying to take in all this information that we're getting about the effects of, variety, of climate, of management strategies, and coming up with, an answer, or at least a range that allows growers to be able to make plans. Like this would kind of be an example at the end of the day of an ideal setup where you kind of put in your region, you put in your variety, and it kind of tells you, okay, here are sort of the, seed yield potential. Here's maybe what we see as an average or a range, both either on an acre or per plant basis. How much confidence can you have in this number? Like how much does it vary year to year? This is just an example and not yet where we're at. We don't have enough data to have, be able to confidently sort of share this information, but this is what we're trying to build towards. Again, kind of all of this data that's going to be answering these questions is coming from these 4 different streams of information coming from those replicated on-station trials that I mentioned, the on-farm participatory trials that all of the growers in our network are growing, as well as the historical information that we're getting from growers and seed companies that have been collecting records over many years and are willing to sort of share their seed yield records as well as information they might have about where those crops were grown, how they were managed, and all the context that seems to be so important in determining yields. When we look at climate, we've taken advantage of this wonderful data set called the PRISM data set that Oregon State University manages, that collects and sort of aggregates weather and climate information from all over the country and models it down to a very small grid so that we can have a sense of things like daily highs and lows and humidity and precipitation, and use all of that to kind of look at how that might impact seed yield as we compare it to how different sites yields look. What we found just from 2025 is that it helps to sort of break down the growing season into 3 phases in terms of the climatic impact on seed yield. Sort of stage 1, what we call stage 1, is early sort of vegetative stage, pre-flowering, and then stage 2 is during flowering, during pollination, flowering, early seed development, and then stage 3 kind of later seed development, maturation, dry down. We found even from our 2025 preliminary data and modeling is that middle stage around flowering and early seed development is often kind of the most critical and predictive in terms of what's happening in with the weather during that stage can really affect your seed yields. In particular, things like really high temperatures and water stress can, even if the rest of the season goes well, that can have a huge impact on your seed yields. The other thing that we found in sort of a place where we realize we need to dig in deeper is that while we've been looking to compare different varieties and how yields on different varieties stack up, that the big difference that we see in terms of yields comes from farm to farm. That within a farm there are certainly differences in the varieties, but when we look across farms, the same varieties grown at different farms have hugely different yields on a per plant or per bed basis. And so one of the things we need to understand is some of that is climatic, certainly, but a lot of that we believe is management, is how those plants are grown, tended, harvested. And so we have more questions and answers in terms of which of those factors matter most. And so going forward, we're really trying to using Nico's seed-linked tool to collect this data along with, so in addition to collecting the seed yields, asking a lot of questions about how those crops were managed, how tillage was done, how irrigation was done, kind of what the seeding and transplanting dates were, cover crop, other practices, to try to turn this sort of huge amount of variation into sort of split it into like, okay, well, we're seeing this huge difference farm to farm, but what are the factors within each farm that make a difference? Here's kind of an example you can see of the yields that we saw from last year in terms of just for our lettuce. So we grew these 3 lettuce varieties at all these different farms, Black Seed Simpson, Red Salad Bowl, and Green Towers. You can see that, you can see both, that the difference in yields by variety, that Black Seeded Simpson yielded more on average, but you can also see, like, look at how much variation there is in yield there and these are all being collected at sort of the same area, so the same square feet or by acre calculations. So these are apples to apples comparisons of yield, and you can see some sites had 10, 20, 50 times more yield than others. One of the things that we're trying to do for participants in these trials is provide a little bit of a sense of like how your farm's yields compare to others at a crop by crop basis. And so I'm going to end, and we'll have a chance to talk about this more in the breakout room. But one of the things that we still have an opportunity for you, if you're interested in participating and sharing this information, being part of this project, we still have an opportunity to sign up for our 2027 trials, for next year's trials. And as part of those, we'll both be contributing to this information that will be helping everyone else out, and also, being able to get sort of farm by farm seed yield reports like the one I shared there.